Welcome back to the deep dive. Now, you sent us something really interesting to unpack this time. It's the raw data from Malawi's 1994 parliamentary election results, specifically the northern and central regions. And we're going to go district by district, constituency by constituency. And just to give you an idea of what this document looks like, it's a detailed breakdown of every single constituency, listing the candidate, their party, the votes they received, and even things like the total valid votes, the null and void votes, the voter registration figures.
Absolutely. And what makes this deep dive so fascinating is that it offers a real granular look at the political landscape of Malawi during this pivotal election year. I mean, this was the first multi-party election in the country's history, right? So by looking at the specific choices made by voters in each constituency, we can actually go beyond the overall narrative and uncover these really interesting local dynamics, regional trends, and maybe even spot some surprises along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you specifically asked us to really dig into the numbers and see what interesting insights we could pull out. So that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Excellent.
So where do you want to start?
Well, if we start in the northern region, what immediately jumps out is the sheer dominance of AFORD. The Alliance for Democracy.
Okay, so let's start with Chitipa District. They have 5 constituencies, and AFORD took all of them. And when I say took them, I mean they won with huge margins. You're looking at winning percentages anywhere from 77% all the way up to 91% in Chitipa. That's impressive.
It is, and it really speaks to the strong regional identity and the prominence of AFORD leaders within the northern region. Perhaps historical factors or specific promises made by the party during the campaign might have contributed to that very decisive outcome.
Yeah, it's clear they had a very solid base of support in Chitipa. I also noticed the percentage of null and void votes in Chitipa was relatively low, generally hovering around the 1% mark. That suggests a pretty smooth and clear voting process.
Yeah. Low null and void votes could indicate a well-informed electorate, people who understood the voting process, clear instructions on the ballot papers, and possibly even effective voter education campaigns leading up to the election.
And it's worth mentioning, Chitipa North had a remarkably high voter turnout, almost 97%.
Wow, that's incredible. That shows a very high level of engagement.
So moving east to Karonga, we see that AFORD dominance continue. They won all 5 constituencies in Karonga as well, with winning percentages pretty much on par with Chitipa, between 76 and over 90%.
Right. And it really solidifies the picture that the northernmost parts of Malawi were firmly AFORD territory during this election, that consistency across those districts.
Yep. But here's something that jumped out at me. In Karonga Central, the percentage of null and void votes jumps up to over 10%. That's quite a difference from the other constituencies we've looked at so far.
Yeah. That is a significant increase. And it definitely raises questions, right? Was there something specific happening in Karonga Central that led to that higher rate? Could it be difficulties in understanding the ballot, maybe some sort of confusion at the polling stations in that particular constituency? It definitely warrants a closer look if we wanted to understand the full picture.
Yeah, definitely something to consider. I also noted Karonga Northwest recorded the highest total number of valid votes in the entire northern region, over 24,500. So a pretty significant number of voters there.
It seems that's where a lot of the population was concentrated at the time.
Moving on to Rumphi, AFORD continued their winning streak, taking all 4 constituencies. Often with those high percentages, we're starting to see as a trend in the north.
Rumphi East is particularly interesting. It shows a complete absence of null and void votes, not a single one, a perfectly clean result. I wonder what could explain that.
Yeah, that is remarkable. Maybe a testament to the effectiveness of voter education in that particular area.
Yeah. Possibly, yeah. Or maybe extremely clear voting procedures, meticulously trained polling staff, It's intriguing.
And, like Chitipa North, Rumphi West had a very high voter turnout as well, almost 90%.
Okay, so we're really seeing high engagement from voters in this region, coupled with that overwhelming support for AFORD.
Okay, let's move on to Ninkata Bay. It looks like AFORD still came out on top here, but the margins of victory were a bit tighter compared to the previous districts we've looked at, particularly in Ninkata Bay North and East.
Interesting. So while AFORD generally won in Ninkata Bay's 7 constituencies, the winning percentages were a bit lower compared to those landslide victories we saw in the northernmost districts.
Right. And we also see a couple of other parties getting some votes in Ninkata Bay North, the Congress for the Second Republic, or CSR, and the Malawi National Democratic Party, the MNDP. So a bit more diversity in terms of party allegiances there.
Yes, it seems the political landscape in Ninkata Bay was perhaps a bit more fragmented, maybe stronger local candidates from other parties who managed to draw some support away from AFORD.
And also a slightly higher percentage of null and void votes in Nakata Bay North, almost 5%.
Mm.
But again, not as high as what we saw in Chronicles Central.
Right, right.
Okay, so the last district in the northern region is Mzimba, a large area with 12 constituencies. AFORD swept all 12 constituencies in Mzimba, including the urban center of Mzuzu City.
And many of those wins in Mzimba were by really huge margins, often exceeding 85% and even pushing into the 90s. It's a clear indication of the stronghold AFORD had in this region.
Mzuzu City itself had the highest number of registered voters in the entire northern region, over 33,000, and as a result, the highest total votes cast.
Makes sense, being an urban center.
It's worth noting, though, voter turnout varied quite a bit across Mzimba. For example, Mzimba Hora had a much lower turnout, only around 50%.
So even within a district that overwhelmingly favored one party, there were still these local variations in terms of voter participation.
Okay, so we've covered the entire northern region. Now let's shift gears and head south to the central region. What kind of picture emerges when we start looking at those results?
The moment you cross into the central region, you immediately see a shift in the dominant political force.
Right. So starting at the Kasungu, which has 8 constituencies, it looks like the Malawi Congress Party, the MCP, performed very strongly here, winning in most of the constituencies.
Yeah. The MCP secured wins in Kasungu North, West, South, Southeast, East, Central, and Northeast. And many of these wins were quite decisive, with percentages often above 60% and even surpassing 80% in some cases.
But it wasn't a complete sweep for the MCP in Kasungu. There were constituencies like Kasungu North Northeast and Kasungu Northwest, where AFORD and the United Democratic Front, the UDF, put up a stronger fight.
Yes, exactly. Showing that even within a region where one party seemed to have the upper hand, there were still pockets of support for other parties, perhaps driven by local factors or the popularity of specific candidates.
Also, we see this pattern of higher null and void vote percentages in some of the Kasungu constituencies, like Kasungu South and Kasungu Northwest. It makes you wonder if there were specific issues or challenges in those areas that we don't see reflected in the raw numbers.
Right. We can speculate, but it's definitely something to note and perhaps investigate further if we had more contextual information.
All right, let's move on to Nkota 5 constituencies. What did the results show us there?
Nkota presents a much more mixed picture. We see wins for AFORD, the UDF, and the MCP across the 5 constituencies. It seems the races were much closer here, suggesting a more competitive political landscape in this district.
Right. And we even had an independent candidate securing some votes in Nkota North. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it does suggest a slightly different dynamic at play in that particular constituency, maybe a well-respected local figure who decided to run outside of the established party structure.
The null and void percentages in Nkota were pretty consistent, generally in that 2 to 3% range, so much closer to what we saw in the northern region.
Interesting. So that higher rate we saw in parts of Kasungu seems to be more of an exception than the rule in the central region so far.
Okay, moving on to Nchisi, a smaller district with 4 constituencies. Looks like the MCP took all of them.
Yep, the MCP won all 4 constituencies in Nchisi, and generally with comfortable margins. The percentages were all above 50%. Nchisi East did have a slightly higher percentage of null and void votes, but not as high as some of those Kasungu constituencies we talked about earlier.
So the MCP seems to be gaining momentum as we move further south in the central region.
Yeah, that's a fair observation.
Next, we have Dowa, a larger district with 7 constituencies. Did the MCP maintain their strong performance here?
They did indeed. The MCP won all 7 constituencies in Dowa, and often by significant margins. Many of the winning percentages exceeded 70%, even pushing 80% in some cases. And similar to some other central region districts, we see that slightly higher percentage of null and void votes in Dowa Central.
Okay, so that pattern of elevated null and void rates in certain parts of the central region is definitely something to keep in mind as we go through these results.
Definitely.
Now we're at Salima, a district with 5 constituencies. Looks like a mix of results here with both the MCP and the UDF securing wins.
Right. Salima presents a bit more of a balanced picture compared to the other districts where we saw a single party dominating. And Salima Northwest had an exceptionally high percentage of null and void votes, over 11%. That's a huge outlier.
That's a massive number. It really makes you wonder what might have happened there. Was there a specific problem with the ballot papers in that constituency? Or maybe confusion about the voting process? It's hard to say without more context.
It's an anomaly that deserves further scrutiny, that's for sure.
All right, next is Mchinji, 6 constituencies. Looks like another strong showing for the MCP here.
Yeah, the MCP won in most of the Machinji constituencies. The winning percentages were generally above 60% or 70%, so a clear indication of strong support for the party there. And again, we see that slightly higher percentage of null and void votes in Machinji North, similar to what we've observed in other parts of the Central Region.
Okay, now on to Lilongwe, the capital district with 16 constituencies. I'm curious to see what the results look like here.
Lilongwe pretty much mirrors that broader trend of MCP strength we've been seeing in the Central Region. The MCP won in the vast majority of the constituencies, often by huge margins exceeding 80% and even 90% in some cases. However, there were some pockets of UDF support, particularly in the city center. The UDF won in Lilongwe City Central, City South, and City West.
Interesting. So even in the capital, where you might expect a more diverse political landscape, the NCP still held a firm grip on most of the constituencies.
Right, and the percentages of null and void votes in Lilongwe were generally lower compared to some of the other Central Region districts we've looked at.
Okay, we're almost done with the Central Region. Just 2 districts left. Dedza with 8 constituencies and Nichu with 7.
So in Dedza, the MCP again demonstrated a strong performance, winning across the majority of the constituencies with comfortable margins. But Dedza also stands out for another reason. It had a really high percentage of null and void votes in several constituencies, continuing that trend we've been observing. And Dedza North had a shockingly low voter turnout, only around 22%. That's by far the lowest we've seen in either region.
Wow, it's incredibly low. It makes you wonder what factors might have been at play there to suppress voter participation so significantly.
Right. Was there some sort of local issue, a lack of access to polling stations, or something else entirely? It's a question that merits further investigation.
Definitely. Okay, what about Nichu? Did we see a similar pattern there?
Nichu is interesting because it shows a different dynamic. The UDF was the dominant party here, winning in most of the constituencies with winning percentages often above 60% or 70%. The MCP did manage to win in Nichu North, but overall it seems the UDF had a stronger base of support in this district. And the null and void percentages in Ju were fairly consistent, around that 2 to 3% mark.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it's really clear that the 1994 election in Malawi was very much a story of regional trends. The North overwhelmingly favored AFORD, while the Central Region was largely an MCP stronghold, though with some notable UDF victories as well.
Absolutely. Looking at the data this way, constituency by constituency, really reveals the complexity of the political landscape at that time.
And beyond those broad trends, there were also some really interesting anomalies and patterns that emerged, like the varying rates of null and void votes, the exceptionally low turnout in Dedza North, and those few instances where other parties managed to break through the dominant party's hold in a specific district. It paints a much richer picture than just looking at the overall national results.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of examining these elections at a granular level, understanding the local dynamics and the factors that might have influenced voting patterns in each specific area.
Absolutely. And it raises a lot of interesting questions, too, about the historical, social, and economic factors that might have shaped those regional preferences. Why was AFORD so dominant in the North? What contributed to the MCP's strength in the Central Region? And what were the specific circumstances in those constituencies where other parties managed to win? There's definitely a lot more to explore here.
This data has given us an incredibly valuable snapshot, but it's just the starting point. The real insights come from digging deeper, asking those why questions, and connecting these results to the broader historical and social context.
Exactly. It's like we've uncovered a fascinating puzzle, and now we need to find all the pieces to truly understand the full picture.
Well said, and thank you for bringing this data to our attention. It's been a truly illuminating deep dive.
Absolutely. And thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.